Marvel Studios, a name that will forever go down in film history as one of the most important in existence. But if it was not for a few important people related to Marvel, the studio would have faded to obscurity. So in this multi-part retrospective, I hope to inform you about everything Marvel and how they came to rule Hollywood. But before we get to Marvel as we know them today, or at Marvel Studios, we have to take a trip all the way back through time to the early 1990s. At the turn of the decade, Marvel found himself in a weird place. Their direct competitor DC Comics just came off a huge success of multiple Superman movies and just launched one of the biggest superhero franchises of all time in form of Batman '89. At the same time, Marvel was struggling to keep any property from doing anything. Captain America had multiple failed movies, Spider-Man was in turmoil on TV and on film, Doctor Strange had a movie that nobody remembers, and long gone were the days where Marvel was ruling TV with the Incredible Hulk. Now, while the live action side of things was pretty awful, there was major success going on the cartoon front. Animated series such as X-Men, Fantastic Four, and most importantly of all, Spider-Man were their keys to success. But that success was short-lived due to poor comic book sales and everything else involved with the business. And on December 27th, 1996, just a few weeks before Christmas, Marvel filed for bankruptcy. The company was losing money hand over fist, and coincidentally, one of their major debts was to Disney for $1.7 million. Over 1/3 of all the employees in Marvel were laid off that week. Lucky for them, the bankruptcy paid off all the major debts and they could refocus on the future of Marvel. And these plans were originally known as Marvel Mania, a chain of restaurants, bunch of Marvel interactive CD-ROMs, and card trading games. Unfortunately, Marvel was still thinking backwards and everything they released was a few years too late. They were forced to close down all of these within a year. With nowhere to go and comic book sales at their all-time lowest, Marvel sought to sell some of their character rights off for movies. Just 2 years into this, in 1998, we would get the first sign of Marvel coming back to life with the release of Blade. Selling the character rights off to New Line Cinema, who at the time and still works for Warner Brothers, was a huge gamble. Blade would go on to have a domestic US total of $70 million. And due to how these licenses were made, Marvel only saw $25,000 of all of its profits. Other properties which were in development hell for years, such as Spider-Man and X-Men, were sold off to Sony and Fox. Now, unlike the Blade deal, the Marvel deal with Fox actually didn't include any money, so Marvel made exactly $0 off the success of any X-Men. And this is where the studio rivalry between Marvel and Fox started. But next up on the horizon was the release of Spider-Man. The poster boy for Marvel would get an upcoming movie release, and this time they had a director and everything was set. Sam Raimi would take the helm and bring on a new generation for Marvel Comics. But before we get into Spider-Man, let's take a trip back to the beginning of the X-Men franchise to X-Men 1. Where at the time a little known person by the name of Kevin Feige was made the associate producer of the X-Men movies due to his extensive knowledge of the X-Men properties along with other Marvel Universe ties. During his time on X-Men, he managed to make a huge impression that got noticed by the newfound Marvel Studios, who was selling off all the movie rights. This studio was run by the one and only Avi Arad, who contacted Kevin Feige and gave him a job. After Kevin Feige was hired as the second in command of the brand new Marvel Studios, their next task was to look at Spider-Man 2 along with Sam Raimi. Kevin being put in charge and being named the executive producer of Spider-Man 2 along with Marvel Studios and Avi Arad, they had way more of a hand in structuring this movie. And this is where he started to form friendships and partnerships with the people at Sony. One such person being Sony's Amy Pascal, who oversaw the Spider-Man franchise and the distribution and products. Years after all of this would be happening, we would go on to learn that Kevin Feige already had some great ideas that did not come to fruition. We would go on and learn that after the production of X-Men 2, which he was the co-producer on, he managed to contact Hugh Jackman and even get him to agree to make a cameo as Wolverine in Spider-Man 2. This was quickly squashed by Fox and thus started the even worse blood between the two rival studios. But Kevin Feige did manage to get one Easter egg in there, which is something that was a passion project of his that was in development since 1998, and he was heavily involved with it, and that was Doctor Strange, but we'll talk about that at a later date. Now, with the success of all of these Marvel movies, not even under the Marvel Studios banner, in 2003, Marvel's David Measle came up with an idea. Why not stop selling all of our characters and focus on the ones we have? And his idea was simple. Let's create our own production studio. Let's develop our movies under our own in-house brand, and we can retain 100% of the profits. And given that this was 2003 and making a comic book movie was still sort of worrisome, Marvel decided to pass on this idea. And this was mainly due to the fact that for the first time in a decade, selling their characters and even making a small profit off the action figures and comics that were being based on the movies was finally giving them some money. They did not want to risk it all starting their own studio and not even owning any of their biggest brands such as the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man. Now, despite Marvel not wanting to move on with a cinematic universe, David Measle was still very persistent at his goal. And his main argument was, if we produce an Iron Man movie or a Captain America and the movie fails, we can't really be worse off than we already are selling everything off to other studios and making no profit. Which brings us to the most important year in Marvel Comics history, which is 2005. That year, the Marvel board approved Measle's plan for a 7-year deal worth $225 million, and this would be used to finance a handful of movies. What was special about this was that this was an independent film company. They would not have to be slaves to anybody and they could do whatever they wanted. At the same time, they went out to Paramount and reached a distribution deal with Paramount Pictures to be able to put their movies out into theaters. If they did not start Marvel Studios at this exact time, Captain America was in limbo of being sold to Warner Brothers. Except there was one condition with this giant Marvel deal. Marvel would have to somehow put up enough collateral to match $225 million. And they did just that. They put up every single major property they had remaining. These 10 properties would include Captain America, The Avengers, Nick Fury, Black Panther, Ant-Man, Cloak and Dagger, Doctor Strange, Hawkeye, Power Pack, and Shang-Chi. And here's the real big kicker. If this plan failed, Marvel Studios would lose the ownership of every single one of these characters. Now, despite all the risks, Marvel already had one goal: build up everything towards the ultimate culmination of everything they could put on the line with the Avengers. But they realized that the crowds were not ready for a giant team-up and that the crowds would turn away if they did not understand who these characters were. Since at this time Captain America has already had a few TV movies that bombed, they figured we can't go with Captain America again. Thor, relatively unknown, so we can't use that. The Hulk, which we will talk about at a later date, was already stuck at Universal with that license about to lapse. But this is when Marvel noticed that something interesting was happening. One of their missing franchises, which wasn't on the list, was of course Iron Man. So where was Iron Man? Well, he was stuck in development hell over at New Line Cinema, which is owned by Warner Brothers, and that license was about to lapse. So 2 months passed since the original Marvel inception of the MCU and the Marvel Shared Universe and Marvel Studios idea was born. They waited and they regained the rights to Iron Man. Now, since Iron Man was not originally included in the $525 million deal, Marvel would have to finance the movie all by themselves. And Marvel decided to do just that, mainly because he's the only character that they owned the rights to that had a big enough star power that they could promote, and it's something that didn't exist so far, and it's a character that, unlike Captain America, hasn't been represented in live action yet. In November of 2005, Marvel Studios officially announced that their first movie would be Iron Man. When they went out there to try to hire writers, they pitched a character in the movie to about 30 writers who all passed on it. Many saying that this was going to be a dead end and one of the biggest box office flops in existence. For a while there, everything went silent up until April 2006, where director Jon Favreau was officially hired by Marvel Studios. Jon Favreau, years after working with Avi Arad already on the production of Daredevil, was interested in doing more comic book things, and this time he would also take on a physical role as being Iron Man's butler and bodyguard, aka Happy Hogan. Now, Jon Favreau had one idea when they set out to make Iron Man: make it realistic and make it believable, and he used Batman Begins, the most recent Batman interpretation, as an inspiration. And his original idea was that he wanted to make Iron Man a story about an adult man who is literally reinventing himself from the ground up after he realizes that the world is not what it seems because he's been ignoring it. Another important element that would become a mainstay in the Marvel Universe was to make sure that the characters were aged appropriately, so he took the original version, which was of course set in Vietnam, and made it set in modern day Afghanistan. Now, before the movie ever started shooting, there were quite a few rumors and quite a few people were interested in playing the role of Tony Stark. Now, before the role would inevitably go to Robert Downey Jr. and save his career and literally reinvent him from the ground up just like Iron Man, there was two other people who screen tested but ended up passing up on the role. The first being Nicolas Cage, who ended up not taking it so he could go produce Ghost Rider for Sony. And the second choice was one of the hottest names in Hollywood, who was Tom Cruise. Now, despite being the star of the movie and of course getting the largest billing in the future of the MCU, Robert Downey Jr. did not actually make as much money as the actual co-star of the movie, Terrence Howard, who was reportedly paid more than 3 times of what Robert Downey Jr. made. Now, with the two main stars of the movie set, they would need someone to co-star along with them. Enter Gwyneth Paltrow, who is of course going to play Pepper Potts, the assistant to Tony Stark. Now that all the actors and everything was set, there was one major problem holding everything back: the villain, as Jon Favreau did not think that Iron Man had many suitable villains, and specifically that the Mandarin would not work as the first villain of the movie. And this was definitely something that Jon Favreau agreed upon, because once he got talked to Mark Millar, who is responsible for writing some of the top comics at Marvel at the time, he felt that the character would be too cheesy and that they would have to alter the tone in a future movie. After that meeting, Marvel and Jon Favreau made the decision to actually use the character much like a Sauron character or Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, make his presence felt in the background, and never show this character on screen. And their presence can of course be felt throughout the entirety of the movie, as the Ten Rings make numerous appearances and are in the background, and they definitely have their presence felt. And this would also start a long-standing tradition of loading the Marvel movies with various Easter eggs. Now, Jon Favreau was also a fan of having Iron Man face someone that is formidably bigger and stronger than him, and the choice was made to make Obadiah Stane the villain of the movie, once Jeff Bridges was cast, of course. This was also another way that they could make it a personal story for Tony Stark's history and family involvement, which they would go on to touch upon in the film, and another way to ground the film and not go too science fiction. Now, originally Marvel intended Obadiah Stane to be the villain for the second movie after they developed that relationship for a while, but instead they decided to go back to the scripts and take out the Crimson Dynamo, who was the villain of the movie up until this point. And as a comic book fan, another Easter egg that Jon Favreau wanted to make sure he put in there was of course the 2 call signs of the attack jets that are chasing Iron Man, which were named Whiplash 1 and Whiplash 2. Which were obviously references to the character of Whiplash, who would go on to be the villain of the second movie. Now, another Easter egg that Marvel wanted to make sure was in there to kind of hint towards the future and what the idea of the franchise was going to be was of course including Captain America's shield in Tony Stark's workshop. Now, when production on this movie started, there was a lot of discussion on what the movie would be about and where it would take place. Jon Favreau was adamant that the movie does not take place on the East Coast, specifically New York, because he was sick of seeing New York and that location in every other comic book movie. So for this reason, the West Coast was chosen. So with all the actors set, filming on the movie began on March 12th, 2007. Which was just a little bit over 12 months close to the release date of the movie. And the first leg of shooting would actually take place in some caves, where they actually shot Tony Stark being captured by the Afghanistan soldiers, and of course how he comes up with the Iron Man Mark I. And since the caves were obviously located in the desert, the exterior shots of Afghanistan were actually shot at the Olanka sand dunes. And the exterior shots that were shot there were done across 2 days, where many of the crew were bothered by the 40 to 60 mile per hour winds, where after that they would finish off some of the shooting at the local Edwards Air Base beginning in mid-April. And then of course there's the exterior shots of the Stark home, which were digitally added to Point Doom in Malibu. Now, Iron Man 1 is notable for being one of the biggest productions in Hollywood to actually not have a finished script. A lot of the stuff that they were doing was just ad-libbed and off the top of their heads, trying to match it up with what the scenes were actually going to be. And for this, the movie gets a lot of credit for feeling so natural and so human. Filming of Iron Man actually concluded on June 25th of 2007 at the Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada. In Vegas is where they shot a majority of the ending fight, which would also include another notable Easter egg, which was the Roxxon Corporation. The Roxxon Corporation would go on to show up in various things from Netflix to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to other Marvel movies. Now, Jon Favreau has stated many times that he was shocked that he was actually able to keep the movie on schedule because he was not a guy to do action. Now, after the shooting was wrapped, Brian Michael Bendis, who's of course one of the writers for many Marvel comics and just so happens to be one of the leads of everything in Marvel now, was actually brought in to write a bunch of dialogue that would be suitable for Nick Fury. Now, this was of course just kept secret, and they would shoot the cameo to attach on to the end of the movie. Unfortunately, even with a small skeleton crew shooting the scenes, the rumors still got out there that Nick Fury was going to be included in the movie somehow. Kevin Feige then had the bright idea to remove the scene from the movie and actually include it at the end of the post-credits. So only the true fans that sat to the end and might have heard about this online were the ones to be rewarded with the Avengers initiative. Now, Nick Fury was initially chosen to actually be portrayed by Samuel L. Jackson because originally when Marvel launched the Marvel Ultimates comics line, they actually went to Sam Jackson and asked for his likeness for the comic book. Now, when it came to the soundtrack of Iron Man, there was one obvious choice to go with for Marvel, and their pick was Ramin Djawadi, who is of course most famously now known for the Game of Thrones theme. Now, after he was chosen, Marvel felt that they also needed another bigger name attached to the soundtrack, thus Hans Zimmer was added. And some of his most notable work would be the soundtrack to the Dark Knight trilogy. So with Marvel wrapping up everything and being in post-production of the movie, their first big chance to make an impression was going to be San Diego Comic-Con 2007. This would be the first big reveal of what was happening with Iron Man. Jon Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. took it to the Marvel stage to reveal the Iron Man Mark I to the crowds waiting. And later on, they would be hosting a panel which would give us the first look at the trailer, which was not made public ever, but unfortunately to them and fortunately to us, on September 9th of 2007, that trailer leaked. I remember the day very well, considering I've been waiting to see what this movie was going to look like with my life, and my best friend at the time, Andy, was making fun of me, saying that this was going to be the biggest flop ever since nobody knew who the character was. Much like the reaction of most of the people at the time on MySpace, which coincidentally enough actually gets a mention in the opening montage scene in the movie. So after the whole San Diego Comic-Con thing, we would officially get Iron Man to hit theaters on April 14th, 2008 to a press screening. The buzz and the premiere was very well received, and the crowds waited to witness what the movie was going to hold. On May 2nd, 2008, Iron Man would release to the United States, and that weekend would go on to make $98 million. And would have a global finish in box office with $582.2 million. Iron Man was now a grade A level star, beating previous record holders like Batman. Not only did the movie do successful in box office take, it also did amazingly well with critics, and currently stands tied for #1 spot for the best comic book superhero movie of all time. The film would also go on to be nominated for various Movie of the Year awards. And during the Saturn Awards of 2009, it would win the Best Science Fiction Film. And as was common back in the day, of course the movie got a video game tie-in to release in the same week that the movie would come out in the United States. The game was published by Sega and released on the PlayStation 2, 3, the PSP, the Wii, Nintendo DS, Xbox 360, the mobile phone, and Windows PC. The game was mainly played from the third person, meaning over the shoulder, having every level within it be open world so you can do anything the way you saw fit. The video game did try to stick as close as possible to the plot of the movie as they could, as obviously Sega did not get the full plot, so spoilers could be prevented. and upon the game's release it received mostly negative reviews, sitting around a 44 out of 100 on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, with the versions that predating those doing far worse and having way more problems that included graphical glitches, controls, and various other game-breaking bugs. The only positive that most of the critics had to say about the game was the fact that the graphics were pretty decent on the current gen consoles, meaning the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 version, and the Iron Man armor looked awesome. And there was also a hint of the MCU connection between this game and the Incredible Hulk, which would come out just a few months later, which I will of course talk about at a later date. But if you did end up having the Incredible Hulk game and you had a save for Iron Man 1 on your console, you were able to unlock the Hulkbuster Suit. So after the success of Iron Man 1, one thing was clear, that this was about to become a giant franchise and that the sky is the limit when it comes to Marvel Comics and their properties on the big screen. Later on the following year, Jon Favreau would of course be back to start directing Iron Man 2, but not before a major change and a major seismic shift would be felt throughout the entire industry of Hollywood and comics, when Disney decided to buy Marvel Comics. The purchase was made on August 31st, 2009. This date would forever change the course of Marvel Entertainment and Marvel Studios and where they go on from here. So tune in for part 2 of this series, where we are going to see an incredible universe start to take shape.